Benvenuto in Dead Sleep True Crime per la buonanotte. Benvenuto in Dead Sleep True Crime per la buonanotte. Benvenuto in Dead Sleep True Crime per la buonanotte.
Welcome back to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime, and as you might have guessed, we will be returning to Italy to revisit a case that we did a story on, actually 2 episodes, back in March of 2024. And those episodes were called The Suitcase and A Perfect Girl. And there's an update on the case that we featured in The Suitcase. And that story was about a family that went on a cruise along the Mediterranean. It was a family of 4, a wife, a husband, and their 2 young children. And whilst on that cruise, the wife, her name was Angie, she went missing. And authorities believe that she went missing around the 2nd or 3rd day of the cruise. But the strange thing was, it was a 2-week cruise, and she disappeared on the 2nd or 3rd day, and yet her husband, Daniel, never reported it. The staff on the cruise didn't know she was missing until the boat came back to Italy and docked. And that's when they figured out that Angie was gone. Now, there were all kinds of theories about what happened to Angie. You'll hear about those in this episode. It's like a rebroadcast of The Suitcase. But for now, I'm going to update you on what happened to Daniel. Daniel Belling was a German national living in Ireland when the family went on this cruise. And the incident, when she went missing, happened in 2017. And her case was brought to international attention because a suitcase washed up on the shore of an Italian beach town called Rimini. And the body that was inside that suitcase was the body of a woman, a petite woman, that authorities first believed were the remains of Daniel's wife, Angie. They were quite certain that the missing persons case was a murder case and therefore believed this was the evidence. This was the body they needed to prove that Daniel killed his wife. Now, in the years since, a lot has happened, and at the same time, this case has been unresolved. For instance, Daniel, who was in his 40s at the time this all happened, he sat in an Italian jail, rotting for 14 months while he awaited trial. Then he somehow was allowed to go back to Ireland. Then he went back to Germany for a little bit, then back to Ireland where he lived with his kids. And just recently, there was a trial, murder trial held in absentia. In absentia means that he wasn't there for it. But the Italian court proceeded without him. And in that court trial, again, where Daniel wasn't there, but his attorney was, the verdict in that case, he was found guilty. Now, the criminal justice system in Italy works a little differently than it does here in the United States. And I'm not saying it's better or worse, but what is unique about it is that it doesn't work on a jury system like we have here. So I'm sure if you listen to Amanda Knox or know her story or know her podcast, you can hear a lot about the issues with the Italian judicial system. But I can say that because there was no jury trial, this was decided by a panel of judges, sort of experts who determined guilt or innocence. And in that case, they determined that he was guilty. Now, the catch is, Daniel is in Ireland. And at this moment in time, there's no extradition happening, which means that Daniel Belling is living in Ireland, but if he returns to Italy, he'll be taken into custody and potentially arrested and detained in connection to the verdict in that case. There are a lot of layers to the Italian court system, and I can't claim to know it, but in the brief amount of research I was able to do in anticipation of this podcast, it seems like this isn't it. There are more layers of decision-making that could determine whether Daniel would go free or if he would have to go to prison. And if he does go to prison, his sentence, according to the reports that I saw, is 26 years for the murder of his wife. When I first recorded 2 episodes about this case, we focused on the suitcase, and that was the suitcase that was found on the shore of an Italian beach town in Italy. And I broke it up into 2 episodes because there was who they thought was in the suitcase, which is Daniel's wife, Angie, and then there was who really was in the suitcase. Those were divided into 2 shorter episodes, but for the purpose of this update and for tonight's episode, I wanted to merge it all into one. So you have the update on Daniel Belling's case. He's been found guilty, he's been convicted of murder in absentia, and is in Ireland figuring out his next steps. But for now, he has been found guilty in Italy for the murder of his wife, Angie, whose remains have yet to be found. So part 1 is what happened in that case. Daniel, Angie, how she went missing, and the status of that case. And then part 2 of this episode is who really was in the suitcase. With that, let's settle in for the night, and we'll revisit an extended cut that's 2 episodes merged together for roughly an hour's worth of listening. And I hope for this extended True Crime Insomniacs cut, it gives you, if nothing else, something to think about as you drift off for the night. So this is The Suitcase and a Perfect Girl, a double episode merged together for you to enjoy and experience as a Dead Sleep episode. Famous for its ancient ruins, stunning beaches, and fresh sea air, the city of Rimini, located along the Adriatic coast of Italy, has been a popular resort town for more than a century. That is, until 2017, when this beautiful beach town became notorious for something else, something ugly, something sinister. It was early Saturday morning in March of 2017. A local Rimini fisherman spotted a medium-sized, dark blue suitcase floating in the seawater just offshore. At first, there's nothing unique about this suitcase. Rimini is a port city where random luggage and other debris from passing ships was fairly common. The contents, however, prove gruesomely distinct. When the suitcase was hauled out of the water and unzipped, a plastic trash bag was found inside. And inside that trash bag was a body, a woman. It was unclear how long she'd been inside that suitcase. But what was painfully obvious, she was dead. The discovery of a suitcase containing the remains of a mystery woman was shocking enough to make international headlines. But Italian police, who were now in possession of the suitcase and the body, weren't exactly shocked. They were hopeful. Because after a frustrating month-long investigation into a missing persons case, one they were quite sure was actually a murder case. Italian authorities had been searching for the one thing they knew would crack this case: the body. But was it her? Close your eyes and imagine it. 12 glorious days traveling along the Mediterranean coast, your every desire fulfilled as you make your way from Italy to Greece to Cyprus, on board a luxury cruise ship. As you sip chilled white wine and soak up the salty air, that stressful life back on shore, the bills, the stress, the arguments, all of that falls away. That's what a cruise ship like the MSC Magnifica promises, with words like opulence, relaxed refinement, that beckon you from their online brochure. And maybe that promise was what beckoned a man I'll refer to as Daniel B., a then 45-year-old German computer engineer, and his 38-year-old wife, a Chinese wedding planner named Shen Lei, who went by the name Angie, to splurge on a family vacation. And it was a splurge. The couple lived in Dublin, Ireland, with their 2 young children, and finances were strained. Angie's wedding planning business specialized in Cinderella-themed ceremonies. Her specialty was making brides feel like princesses. Maybe Angie hoped this cruise would transform her own marriage into a fairy tale. Instead, within days of boarding the ship on February 9th, 2017, those dreams would vanish. And so would Angie. But let's begin on the majestic ship, the MSC Magnifica. Built for $500 million back in 2010, the luxury boat was like a floating metropolis. The ship was more than 3 football fields long, capable of holding more than 5,000 people, crew and guests combined. With 13 viewing decks, 2 pools, a casino, bowling alley, and dozens of bars and restaurants. Which might explain why nobody seemed to notice when, at some point in the cruise, a family of 4 had shrunk down to a party of 3. Dad and the 2 kids. Breakfast, lunch, dinner, playtime, day after day. It wasn't until the last day, February 20th, when the cruise ship returned to its home port about an hour outside of Rome. The crew did a final digital head count as guests disembarked. And that's when they discovered the numbers didn't add up. According to the cruise line's computerized tracking system, which keeps a digital record of each passenger as they enter or exit the ship, nearly all of the passengers had arrived back to Italy, safe and sound, except 1. The record showed a passenger named Angie was missing. With the bustle of a busy cruise, it's not a huge surprise that most people hadn't noticed that Angie wasn't there. Well, with one exception, her husband, Daniel. Certainly he'd noticed that Angie wasn't there, and yet, for the entire 11-day cruise, he said nothing. That was highly unusual and suspicious. What, the crew wondered, was going on? As the ship's crew dug into the last 11 days of the cruise, it appeared after that first day or 2 on that ship, there was no record of Angie. She was not recorded leaving the ship at any point or getting back on the boat anywhere. She just disappeared. By the time they realized there was a missing passenger, Angie's husband, Daniel, and their 2 children had already left the ship and were presumably on their way back home to Ireland. Which was strange. Why didn't Angie's own husband say anything to anyone about her missing? The ship's crew contacted the Italian authorities in Rome. They needed to find passenger Angie, where she was, and what, if anything, had happened to her. It was a dramatic scene. Police rushed to the airport in Rome. Daniel and his 2 children were just about to board their plane back to Dublin. But before they got on that plane, Italian police swooped in, escorting the family back to Rome and taking Daniel into police custody. In short order, Italian police developed their timeline, and with that, a frightful theory of what happened to Angie. On February 9th, 2017, the family boarded the ship. By February 10th or 11th, that's within 2 days of boarding the ship, Angie was somehow murdered. Daniel was their one and only suspect. Right away, police accused Daniel of killing his wife while in their cabin. Exact method? TBD. But after she was gone, authorities said he disposed of his wife's body by stuffing her into her own suitcase, hauling the bag to their cabin balcony, then throwing the suitcase over the railing and into the Mediterranean Sea. Once she was taken care of, Daniel carried on as if nothing had happened. He continued to enjoy the cruise with his young children without saying a word to anyone that she was gone. It wasn't clear what he told his own kids, but Angie's own mother, who lived with the family back in Ireland, wasn't informed by her son-in-law that her daughter had gone missing while on that cruise ship. Police would soon learn that Daniel and Angie were seen arguing before they boarded the ship on that very first day. They also found out one of the crew members overseeing the family's cabin was at first told to make up a guest bed, presumably for the father to sleep in. Daniel later arranged for that guest bed to be put away. They were only 3 now. They didn't need the extra bed anymore. As Daniel sat in front of police, things didn't look good. But Daniel insisted the police had it all wrong. He had his own version of what happened, and if his story were true, Angie's so-called murder was really one of the most bizarre and elaborate revenge plots in recent memory. The sort of double-crossing betrayal from out of a 1940s film noir. Angie was alive, and Daniel had been set up. Early in the cruise, the boat docked in a port city in Greece, and as Daniel and the kids wandered around, Angie went off on her own, and she didn't come back. She left with her suitcase, most of her belongings, and a plan, Daniel told detectives, to start a new life without him. Angie had been threatening to leave for years. She wasn't just sick of her husband, Daniel. She was sick of living in Europe, he said. She'd even seen a mental health professional and, according to her husband, told this doctor she was tired of her life in Ireland and wanted to return to China. In Daniel's version, she'd done just that. The cruise that was supposed to be a family outing was secretly her way out. She was probably somewhere in China right now. As for the most incriminating detail in the case, why he didn't report this to the crew, well, why would he? Yes, it's a terrible thing to do, but it's not a crime to walk off a ship and leave your family. And the worst that could happen to someone leaving a cruise early was a penalty of a few $100. Daniel said his wife was known for her impulsive temper. He was used to it. So when she left, he decided to keep a stiff upper lip, focus on the kids, having a good time, and he'd deal with the fallout of his marriage later. These were not the actions of a homicidal sociopathic husband, but the motive of a good parent. What's more, Daniel not only asserted that his wife was alive and well, he believed she'd actually set him up in some kind of crazy scheme to frame him for her murder. What Angie's endgame would be wasn't quite clear. But between the police and Daniel, there were only 2 sides. They said he's guilty. He said he was innocent. Was it possible there was another unexplored side to the story? Something else that had gone on. In a strange coincidence, at that time, another young woman mysteriously vanished from that very same cruise line, from that very same port city where Angie was last seen. This woman, also a Chinese national, was in her 20s when she went missing from the ship back in 2015. Like Angie, there was no record of her leaving the ship, no footage of her doing anything unusual. She just disappeared. These two women fit a basic but notable profile. Same country of origin, same ship, same location of the alleged disappearance. The difference was, back in 2015, the Greek Coast Guard was made aware that the woman had gone missing. And authorities conducted a lengthy search for that woman in the water and the surrounding area. But she was never found. But with that case, officials decided that she'd fallen overboard. Her disappearance was ruled an accident, kind of a death by a misadventure theory. Could something have happened to Angie in Greece, or had she fallen overboard? Her husband claimed she had mental health issues and suffered from depression. Was it possible that she jumped? Back in Rome, the Italian police weren't buying some bonkers alternative theory. It wasn't suicide, no death by misadventure, and certainly not walking away and disappearing back to China. There was only one explanation for the disappearance of Angie: murder. On February 24th, just 4 days after the cruise ended, Daniel appeared in Italian court and was charged with his wife's murder. As Italian prosecutors built their case, Daniel's children were sent away, and Daniel was placed in an overcrowded Italian jail in Rome, where he'd spend the next 14 months awaiting trial and swearing that he was innocent. The Italian prosecutor's working theory that Daniel killed his wife and somehow disposed of her body was compelling, especially because Daniel's behavior during the cruise was odd. But did the prosecution have enough to prove, without a doubt, that Daniel killed his wife? That was the real question. Angie's disappearance went unreported for several days until the cruise was over, which meant if Daniel did kill his wife on that second day, as detectives said he did, Daniel had an epic lead on getting rid of any incriminating evidence. And witness testimony? With so many passengers and crew members spread out all over the world, relying on witness testimony would have proven a challenge. No, there was only one way to clinch this. Only one piece of evidence that would have closed that case. They needed the body. The very body that appeared to emerge a month later, miraculously, upon that Italian shore near Rimini. If this were Angie, it would only be a matter of time before the medical examiner would reveal her manner of death. They could prove that Daniel killed his wife. And this case would be caso chiuso, case closed. At first, authorities had reason to be confident. When the body was examined, it appeared the gender, size, and ethnicity of that body were the remains of a small Asian woman. But upon further investigation, they realized the body was a few inches too tall. And was this woman Chinese? The body was now too decomposed to say for certain. And then there were the other facts that didn't fit the case. This suitcase was dark blue. In photos from the day that Angie and Daniel boarded that cruise, her suitcase was evidently orange. Then there was the location where the suitcase was found. The cruise was along the Mediterranean. The town of Rimini was way too far, quite literally an ocean away, from where police alleged the suitcase was dumped by her husband early on in the cruise. oceanography experts later weighed in on the case. A suitcase dropped in the Mediterranean near Greece would likely head southwest, closer to Egypt or Libya, not the opposite direction towards the Adriatic coast of Italy or Eastern Europe. Italian police were out of luck. This wasn't Angie. Had it actually been Angie's remains? The case against Daniel B. might have been resolved back then. But due to various issues, the court date for the murder trial has been pushed back more than once. Since his initial arrest 7 years ago, Daniel has maintained his innocence and continues to insist that Angie left the ship alive. Alive and well. Very well. Daniel's lawyers told an Irish news outlet that they had evidence, including phone records and a credit card statement, that established she was active after the cruise ended in 2017. What's more, the legal team claimed to have proof, including text messages, of an extramarital affair. The details about this affair were vague, but his lawyers suggested they had enough evidence to prove that Angie was alive, that she'd left the ship voluntarily, and Daniel was innocent. Or there was, at the very least, enough reasonable doubt to set Daniel free. Throughout the investigation, Angie's mother appeared to be of two minds. She told the media she didn't believe her daughter was in China, but she also made a point of supporting her son-in-law, at one point telling an Italian news outlet she didn't believe he'd hurt her daughter. After being in custody, then out on bail, flying back and forth from Italy to Ireland, Daniel returned home to Ireland, where he now lives. There were reports of his trial happening in absentia, which means his murder trial could happen without Daniel there. Trying someone in absentia without the accused person in the courtroom is extremely rare in the United States. But in Italy, it's apparently very common. The most famous case of someone being tried for murder in absentia in Italy was Amanda Knox. As you likely know, Amanda Knox had already been spun through the Italian legal machine a couple of times. Convicted, then exonerated. It's when Amanda Knox was back in the U.S. around 2014 that she learned the Italian court was revisiting her case and ultimately decided to uphold her guilty verdict, resentencing her to nearly 30 years in prison. As you might expect, Amanda Knox was like, hell no, I am not going back to Italy. Which worked out anyway, because in 2015, she was exonerated again in absentia. For Daniel, if he is found guilty in absentia, the Italian court would demand he turn himself in to Italian authorities and serve his sentence, which Daniel told reporters he has no plans to do. As for the prosecution's case, Italian authorities apparently tracked down various witnesses who were prepared to testify, including ship employees who recalled seeing one of Daniel's children wandering the ship barefoot after his mother vanished, among other reports of strange behavior. An Italian newspaper quoted a Genoa shop owner who said he remembered seeing Daniel and Angie together on February 10th, 2017. That was the last day anyone saw Angie alive. And this shop owner? He remembered Daniel handing his wife a pair of sneakers and telling her to put them on instead of her sandals and to shut up. Witness testimony like that could prove Daniel's an asshole in a bad marriage. But a murderer? They'd likely need something more concrete. The MSC Magnifica was a new ship, and most cruise ships since 2009 have had surveillance cameras with motion sensors. If someone falls overboard, or jumps overboard, or is tossed overboard, those cameras are supposed to capture that kind of activity. But what about in this case. If authorities had found footage like that, featuring Daniel or Angie, they haven't revealed that in the international press that I saw. In 2023, Daniel told an Irish tabloid that he's gone through every scenario in his head, and he still believes his wife left the ship on her own. But now he has a new theory, a strange theory, that his wife was kidnapped. Asked if he missed his wife or if he planned to look for her, he replied that it was complicated. You know where else things were complicated? Back in the Italian town of Rimini. Authorities now had 2 unsolved potential murder cases and 1 urgent question. If this wasn't Angie, who is in the suitcase? And how did she get there? Find out in the next episode of Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. It was springtime in Rimini, Italy, 2017. If you caught the previous episode called The Suitcase, you'll remember the beautiful beach town of Rimini, Italy was just ramping up for the tourist season when a local fisherman spotted a dark blue suitcase bobbing in the water. He opened the suitcase, revealing a trash bag. Inside the trash bag were the remains of a person, a woman. Italian authorities thought they knew exactly who this woman was, and they'd hoped this discovery would help them solve the case of a missing cruise ship passenger who disappeared while on a Mediterranean vacation with her family a month earlier. Then the Italian authorities turned the suitcase and the remains over to the medical examiner. And that's when authorities learned the facts didn't add up. This body wasn't their missing cruise ship passenger, which meant local Italian authorities had a whole different case, a whole new mystery. Who was this woman, and how did she end up curled inside a suitcase? They had no idea. There was no ID, no tag on the suitcase, and no time to waste in figuring out what was going on. Because it was late March, early April, the off-season for a resort town like Rimini. Things are typically quiet in the off-season of any beach town. Mostly locals, not much action, and that's how people liked it. Any hint that a tourist town wasn't safe, especially for a young woman to travel to on holiday, could lead to financial ruin for a beach town that made most of its revenue during that short window of vacation season, May through August. They needed this case figured out before word spread, before any nervous tourists changed their travel plans. So who was this woman? Finding out her identity was, of course, step 1. Here's what they did know. After the body was brought to the morgue and examined, they determined a few basics. This woman in the suitcase was in her mid-20s. She was around 5'6" or 7 inches in height. At first they thought she was Asian. Then they determined she was likely Caucasian, possibly from Eastern Europe. There were thousands of women in Italy who could fit this description. But there was something unusual about this woman's body. Something disconcertingly distinct. The dead woman's body weight. When this young woman was alive, the medical examiner determined that she weighed 35 kilos. That's just 77 pounds. A baseline healthy weight for a woman who is 5 feet 6 inches tall is closer to 118 pounds. It was clear to the medical examiner that this woman suffered from severe malnutrition, and her frail condition was directly connected to her cause of death, according to the examiner's findings. This woman appeared to have died from complications caused by her malnutrition. To put it bluntly, she starved to death. Then, the examiner said she was either dead or very close to dying when she was placed inside the suitcase and plunged into the Adriatic Sea. So Italian authorities knew the nature of her death. But the rest, who she was, how she ended up in the suitcase, and who put her there, was as murky as the ocean water she was found in. The neglected remains of a young Eastern European woman, discarded in the open water, one couldn't help but consider a grim but all too common scenario. Was this woman a victim of human trafficking? Recent statistics around human trafficking, especially in Italy, supported this theory. Human trafficking was rampant in Italy, with numbers in the thousands. According to a 2019 report published by Save the Children in Italy, nearly 35% of young women and children brought to Italy for forced labor or prostitution were from Eastern Europe, including countries such as Romania, Albania, and Bulgaria. In 2017, when this woman's body was found, Italy had stepped up its efforts to address the issue. But the fact was, human trafficking was a ruthless, intricate web of deception and control, a web that could trap a young girl for years. Was this 20-something woman somehow connected to the trafficking trade, a casualty of a life lived and lost among strangers? There are thousands of stories that could end like that. And according to a 2021 study by the U.S. State Department, the effects of the pandemic, climate change, and economic inequality has increased human trafficking worldwide. But the woman in the suitcase, that wasn't her fate. Fingerprints taken by the examiner in the morgue revealed the woman was a Russian national. A few days later, Italian investigators even had a name: Katerina Laktionova. And as they dove into the investigation and the circumstances around her death, they learned that Katerina's story wasn't about strangers. It was about family. And just how far circumstances could drive the people closest to you to do shocking things. Things that were past the boundaries of reality, past humanity, and into a darkness so deep, there was no hope of turning back. But let's start with a happier time. It was 2015, 2 years earlier, when a beautiful Russian girl named Katerina moved from Russia to Italy to fulfill a dream. Katerina dreamed of being a model, which made perfect sense. Many of the world's top models were Russian, and similar to Russian ballerinas, the image of the Russian model came with a certain expectation, a physical ideal. Tall, lean, strikingly, stunningly beautiful. And Katerina was a natural for that look. Already a dancer, model, and college student back in her native Russia, it seemed being in front of the camera was part of Katerina's DNA. In professional photos found online, Katerina is pictured posing in a polka-dotted two-piece swimsuit, slim legs resting daintily over a chair. Her shiny brown hair, almond-shaped brown eyes, and prominent cheekbones come alive on camera. But modeling was a tough business, and some essential, albeit outdated, characteristics required for a successful modeling career came down to genetics. And there were things that could be changed and other things that couldn't. At around 5'6", Katerina was short by traditional modeling agency standards, which typically started at 5'9". And at 25, Katerina was on the mature end of modeling, which didn't mean she wouldn't get work, But most models with long careers started out in their teens. It was a fact. Katerina couldn't control how tall she was or the year she was born. But she could control her body in another way, the way many successful models were pressured to do. Katerina could control her weight. Just a warning here. Over the next few minutes, I'm going to describe aspects of anorexia nervosa and disordered eating. Now, it was unclear when Katerina was clinically diagnosed with anorexia nervosa, but members of her family reported that well before she moved to Italy, Katerina engaged in some form of disordered eating, including severe food and caloric restriction back home in Russia. Her stepbrother said in an interview that she always wanted to be a model, and she was obsessed, he said, with being perfect. In 2015, Katerina relocated to Rimini, where her 40-something mother, Gulnara, lived and worked as a caregiver. As a beach town along the coast, Rimini wasn't a convenient location for an aspiring model. But it appeared Katerina loved Rimini, and as she'd soon realize, advancing her modeling career wouldn't happen as she might have planned. Because what did advance, at a rapid pace, was her illness. Her condition required several visits to local hospitals for urgent treatment for malnutrition. Her mother would later say Katerina resisted psychological treatment to address her disorder. But in 2015, when Katerina first moved to Italy, she recognized her illness was serious enough to apply for and receive a special residence permit under the category of humanitarian and health protection. This special residence permit allowed Katerina to legally stay in the country and receive health care and other social services from the Italian government for a period of 2 years. Without this special humanitarian and health status, Katerina risked living in the country illegally, which also put her health at risk. If she needed care, her mother would have to pay out of pocket for treatment around Katerina's illness, a cost her mother couldn't afford. The permit was set to expire in 2017. For Katerina, the continuation of this special status to keep her in the country was a matter of life and death. It was a great effort to have the energy and the determination to leave the house. One of the last times, possibly the last time Katerina was seen out in public alive, was that February in 2017. She'd already been hospitalized several times for life-saving, urgent care to treat her condition. But she managed to make it in person to the authorities in Rimini to renew her special residence permit. She explained her condition and told authorities she needed to stay in Italy for her recovery. She emphasized that without this continuation of treatment, she could die. Sadly, her request was rejected. She was told she was not going to be receiving this special status, and she'd have to go back to Russia and leave Italy. The specific reason for the denial of her request wasn't clear. Taking a step back, Katerina was one of thousands unwittingly caught up in a growing anti-immigrant sentiment that was affecting public policy. It was all over the news. Thousands of migrants were coming to Italy via North Africa, Eastern Europe, and the Mediterranean, which meant a sharp increase of refugees seeking asylum or humanitarian protection status. Their circumstances were different, but the status they sought, that special protection, was akin to what Katerina had. Around that time, a conservative movement in the Italian government pushed for tighter restrictions around special protection status. These strict policies would become law by 2018. In photos, Katerina was the perfect girl, but on paper, to immigration, she was an unwanted foreigner. Katerina begged to stay, but these circumstances were beyond her control. When Katerina's protected status was turned down, she was just one of thousands cast out in that sweeping crackdown. She was now fighting for her life. Authorities rejected her special visa request in February of 2017. Days later, Katerina disappeared. It was March 10th, 2017, 15 days before the discovery of that suitcase. One of Katerina's friends was on the phone. He'd been trying to reach Katerina for days, and he'd gone from generally concerned to gravely worried. Where was Katerina? At last, on that day in March, a phone call. It was Gulnara, Katerina's mother. She and Katerina had left Rimini, and she was taking Katerina to a well-known specialist. There was no reason to worry. Everything was fine. But the friend noticed something wasn't right. The call was coming from a local Italian number, which didn't make sense. Gulnara said she was in Russia. When this friend pressed her for more details, she seemed agitated and vague. What was also strange is, why would Gulnara take Katerina to Russia for treatment when Katerina had come to Italy because Russia didn't have the treatment she needed? What was she really doing there? What had really happened? After the call, this friend became suspicious, but he didn't know what to think. Until around 2 weeks later, on that ominous day in late March, this friend saw the news that a local fisherman had found a suitcase. There was a young woman inside, identity not yet known. This time, when Gulnara called, she did appear to be calling from Russia with a Russian number, and this time the friend asked her point blank. "Tell me the truth," he said. "Is your daughter alive or dead?" Gulnara, on the other end of the phone, burst into tears. She couldn't keep her secret anymore. She said she would tell him everything, and what she told him was shocking. And it was, she swore, the truth. After the call, the friend ran to the Rimini police station. He frantically revealed everything that Gulnara had told him about what happened to Katerina. The shocked authorities issued an arrest warrant for Katerina's mother. What the hell happened? "I'm ready to explain everything," Gulnara said in a hushed tone over the phone. She was speaking from her family's home in Russia to her lawyer back in Italy, where authorities were waiting for her to take her into custody. It was April, and investigators were desperate to figure out what happened to Katerina. What did her mother know? What did her mother do? Gulnara confessed what she could remember. She swore that she planned to take her daughter back to Russia alive to get help. That first phone call with the friend, she was still in Italy. She wasn't in Russia. But that second time, she really was in Russia. But Katerina was not. Gulnara described how she felt helpless. Katerina had been hospitalized several times in recent months. She described how she was desperate to get Katerina into a special clinic in Italy, but couldn't afford the cost. Gulnara described how Katerina never left the house, never left her room. She described the wasting away of Katerina's body as a candle being consumed by its flame. Then one day in March, Gulnara went into Katerina's room and discovered her daughter lying there, lifeless. Gulnara remembers that moment. She said it was a blur, bits and pieces, that when you put them all together, went something like this. After discovering her daughter in bed, Gulnara didn't rush to call an ambulance for any Hail Mary life-saving efforts, or the police to report her daughter's death. She didn't frantically dial Katerina's father back in Russia, or that friend in Rimini. Instead, Katerina's mother did nothing. No, that's not quite right. She did something. She sat down next to her daughter's body and stayed there. One day went by, then 2, 3, 4, then 5. For 5 days, she sat there in willful disbelief. Her daughter wasn't dead. She couldn't be. Gulnara was a trained caregiver, so she knew a dead body when she saw one. But she described experiencing a grief so powerful, it quickly turned to madness. A kind of hysterical denial that pushed her to do what most would find unthinkable. After sitting with the body for 5 days, Gulnara, a middle-aged woman of average strength, somehow lifted her daughter's body, still around 70-something pounds of inert weight. She fit the body inside her medium-sized dark blue suitcase. Her plan was to bring her daughter back to Russia, but then, somewhere along the way, the reality of getting the suitcase through security with her daughter inside seemed impossible. She'd get caught. She panicked. She couldn't keep her daughter in the apartment, but she couldn't bring her daughter's remains to Russia either. She looked out onto the coastline, and she wheeled the suitcase down towards the water and dumped that suitcase into the Adriatic Sea. There was speculation that, with the weight of the suitcase and its contents, she might have had help. No, she insisted. She did this all alone. She then boarded her flight to Russia and kept what she did a secret, even to herself. Katerina's mother said she truly believed if she threw the body away, then the actuality of Katerina's death would go away. Katerina would be alive, and all this, her daughter's illness, her despair, her death, the disposal, never happened. Things could go back to the way they were, a devoted mother and her perfect girl. Gulnara could have stayed in Russia and avoided punishment, but she didn't. She decided to fly back to Italy. She turned herself in, and when she did, it made huge headlines. People didn't know what to make of the mother who tossed her daughter into the sea. And I felt the same way when I came across this story. I admit it was a combination of horror and judgment. I was fascinated by it too. The idea of a woman sitting by her daughter's bedside day after day after day. The human mind is capable of doing all kinds of things to deny that profound loss. Even find ways to pretend like that loss, it didn't happen. But it did happen, and Gulnara was going to have to face the consequences. What kind of punishment did a woman like this deserve? That was what Italian authorities had to decide now. In the spring of 2017, she was charged with improperly disposing of a corpse and negotiated a prison sentence of 14 months. This sentence was deferred indefinitely, which meant Gulnara wouldn't spend any time in prison. What's more, she was finally able to say goodbye to her daughter. On May 23, 2017, a Rimini charity group arranged a funeral service for Katerina. Her mother was in attendance, along with other close family members. She was buried in a local cemetery in Rimini. Katerina loved this city, her mother said, and now she can stay forever. Thank you for listening to Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'll be back in a few days with an all-new true crime story. And until next time, nighty-night.